order a little bit and start with Libby Sisson, and then Margaret Nelson, and then Cohen Simpson. You can ask questions right after their presentations, or we might also have time for Q&A collectively at the end of all three presentations. Feel free to ask questions. They're presenting their research sometimes for the first time, sometimes again, and hopefully this is something they'll continue to work on. So we're really excited. We thank them for sharing their research, and thank you all for being in the audience. So let's go ahead and kick it off with Libby. And only other thing I wanted to add is Aramark may come in and start setting up for lunch, but they'll be over here and we'll ask them to be quiet. So thanks, Libby.
Hi, I'm Libby Sisson. My advisor is Dr. Shannon Holland, and my presentation is What is Activism? Exploring the Production and Application of Activism in Modern Society. So, coming into this departmental honors project, I knew I didn't want to do the typical thesis. I wanted to do something active with the community and the campus, so I chose instead to work with scholarly sources and then to extend it into my own avenues of outreach. And so some of my goals when it came to the project were to contribute to scholarly and lay conversations regarding activism, to critically examine the relationship between corporate interest and social activism, to open up avenues for discussion about activism, and then to be an activist myself. So my project has three main parts, and how I decided to do this was to do smaller projects that all revolved around the central theme of activism. The first is a critical textual analysis of Gap Inc. and Product Regs campaign. The second is the creation of a public service announcement for Sexual Trauma Awareness Month, and then also my participation in the 495 Human Symposium Adventure Project with Dr. Holland's class. So to start, my paper, a little bit of paper background just to give you some information. Gap, I'm talking about the clothes, and then the Red campaign is a nonprofit organization set up by Bono and Bobby Schreiber that gives part of profits that are shared with the companies involved to 4 small countries in Africa, to the women and children with AIDS in 4 small countries in Africa. So that's the Red campaign in a nutshell. My particular argument about this campaign is that through Gap's advertisements, they serve to demonstrate the prevalence of commodity activism in our society and to redirect our attention using sexuality and a Western savior narrative from the practices and policies of companies in our advertising to provide us with this false sense of good and activism. So what I wanted to really do is to contribute to some of these ongoing scholarly conversations regarding commodity activism, sexuality, those sort of things. To start, it's not particularly impressive to have a list of references, but what I want to do is kind of talk a little bit about each of these. In the Better piece, in the book Global Spin, he discusses how industries have capitalized on new markets through the rising environmental consciousness. And then Puzula continues this in the piece Resisting National Breast Cancer Awareness Month, when the author talks about the way in which we're so focused on being environmentally sound that there's no longer a distinction between discourse and practice. So what is being green? Well, it's being green. What do we do for it? Oh, we buy a product that says green on it. And so this is kind of the idea of commodity activism, in that we purchase something and that makes us a good person, or we are an activist because we make a certain purchase. Goldman, Heath, and Smith discuss this commodity, this self-made better by the commodity mind frame that our society has embraced. So we are moral and we become better people through making these purchases. And then additionally, Rachel discusses how sexual advertising has become so emotional in nature that it really allows us, or that it allows the advertising that is sexual to pierce our senses and get straight to us and distracts us from the actual, maybe the point of the advertisement. So the text that I looked at for my paper revolved around 4 different things. One is the poster pictured on the right, and it was the main poster for the Gap campaign, Red campaign. And then I also talked about a poster that with John Legend and the African Children's Choir, and that's what I used for a lot of the Western Savior narrative. The images from www.babygap.com, I talk a lot about symbolic currency and how placing a onesie on a baby is, denotes a sense of status instead of actually being an activist. And then my last textual piece was the Product Red slogan, which is where desire meets virtue. So in terms of critical arguments, do the red thing. I'm just going to briefly go over some of them. If I went over all of them, I would be talking for forever. With this poster, which sadly you can't see very well, I start off with the middle text, do the red thing, that you can't see. So how it immediately makes consumers, or gives consumers the idea of making a morally sound purchase. It gives them this morally sound purchasing atmosphere. And at the bottom, it says, can an individual change the world? Yes, you can. This directly gives consumers agency in terms of, oh yeah, I am being part of this activism and part of this wave helping the world. Where desire meets virtue is one of the next critical arguments I make, and that's more of an ethical argument based on the fact that the idea that you desire something is the idea that you want something. It's not necessarily something that you need, and so to go out and want to buy a very expensive t-shirt that you want, that you don't need, is problematic when you're trying to help people who don't even have their basic needs met in terms of medication, potentially. And then also there's the idea of sexual advertising, which you can notice in a few of these pictures here. Christy Turlington is the yoga instructor on the right. You can't see as well through the detail, but you can't see her shirt, or what her shirt actually says in terms of the red advertising. You can see a full outline of her breasts, and if you look really closely, her nipples. You can't tell if she's wearing pants, and she's really not doing anything in terms of being an activist, being red. It's a sexual advertisement. And the same with Don Cheadle in the bottom center. He's taking off his red shirt, which I find to be interesting. He's showing you his muscles, and he's giving you a flirty little glance. What I find problematic with the sexual advertising is not only that it distracts from the overall campaign's goals, but sex and unprotected sex is what proliferates AIDS. And so the fact that they're using this to advertise for an AIDS campaign is it's questionable, it's problematic, it's inappropriate, quite honestly. And so those are some of my arguments that I make in my paper. The big so what, why does it matter? I'm really just trying to demonstrate how we as a society may be missing important messages or actions through avenues of commodity activism and with the distraction of sexual advertising. So that's kind of the first part of my project and the more scholarly aspect of it. So second part, I wanted to be an activist. I wanted to reach out to the community, and I interned with Foothills Alliance, which is a sexual trauma center and a children's advocacy center in Anderson that serves Anderson and Macomb counties. It's a staff of 5, completely run off of government funding. Everything is free to anyone who walks in. Needless to say, they don't have a lot of time to reach out to the community. And so I thought maybe I could be a help with that. And so I decided to create a PSA for them to air during April, which is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So I've never made a PSA before, so I had to start from scratch. And what a better place than YouTube. I YouTubed PSAs on sexual assault, especially here in South Carolina. RAIN, which is the Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network, has a bunch. They're very emotionally charged. There were a few from South Carolina that were kind of cheesy about men respecting women, but it kind of gave me a platform to start from, to see what was out there. And then some of the other research that I did was just to find what makes an effective PSA. So the first article about emotional information management basically talks about how men and women associate with the emotions that they feel during an advertisement, or a PSA in this case. They say women, it looked at recognition of emotion, how they deal with the recognition, and empathy. And so they found that women were more emotionally attached to their emotions than men. And that was interesting and gave me sort of a guide to where I should go with who to target for the PSA. And then the second article is about liking and how if someone likes a PSA, they're more likely to follow the behavior that's prescribed during the PSA. And this one dealt with adolescence and smoking, but I was hoping that using the same idea that women or men who are listening to the PSA would establish some sort of rapport with the sexual trauma agencies and then be more inclined to use them should anything happen to someone they know or themselves. Just some sexual violence and public awareness statistics that I wanted to include as well is that 1 out of every 6 women are sexually assaulted in their lifetimes. Most victims in some way think it's their fault, and that only 1 out of every 16 assailants are actually put in jail. And the trial is more about attacking the credibility of the victim than about the assailant who did these awful acts. And so those are some things I really wanted to get across in the PSA, some things that I wanted to see change happen with. So as community education, I wanted to reach out, so I had to go to the radio stations to find out what I needed to do. They were very unhelpful. The guidelines on their website were very minimal, if anything. So I emailed all of them in the local area and got no response. Emailed again with more information, got no response. Finally, one woman responded to me back that they would not play pre-recorded PSAs. They would only maybe read it if it was a script on letterhead, which I decided not to send a script to radio stations because sexual assault is such a personal and sensitive issue, and having a random radio DJ read it at some point, I couldn't choose the context. I can't place the words. I can't choose how he says it or she says it. And so that was problematic for me, and I decided not to do that. And according to the FCC, you can have no call to action in your PSA because it's free. So I couldn't say, go to this, do this, step up. I just say things like, for more information, contact, yada, yada. But Clemson's WSBF was really helpful. They finally got back to me, helped me record the PSA, they smashed it up, put music to the background, and are playing it this month. So that is a success. It is on the radio. In terms of constructing it, I wanted to include a few things, like targeting women. Sexual assault mostly happens to women, and when it comes to being advocates or supporting, what I've seen in my internship is that mostly women are there, and I'm not sure why. It's not noted, but I think it has something to do with the comfort level. And so that's who I wanted to target. And then also create a liking for identification. I didn't want my PSA to just be about reaching people who have been sexually assaulted. I wanted it to be about people who would be advocates for sexual assault victims, for society in general to step up and start talking about this issue to be silenced because it might be uncomfortable. And then I also wanted to include facts to catch attention and balance the emotional feels. So I wanted to use some of those facts I mentioned before to get people going, wow, this isn't right. Only 1 out of 16 people go to jail? That's a violent crime. And I hope that it works, and I hope that some people hear it, it touches someone's heart. So that's the second part, and my third part's shorter, I promise. Activism is ongoing, it's always happening, and I think that one of the most important things is speaking about it and getting little knobs and heads turned, and suddenly there will be change. It will come about. And so one of the things I did was I took my paper on commodity activism with GAP to Minneapolis last weekend, where I presented at a research conference, to, I think, a very receptive audience. It was an interesting experience being around all of the academics. And then I also, or a different set of academics, I should say. No offense, Matt. Sorry. And then my participation in the Human Adventure Symposia with Dr. Hahn's class, you've probably seen our stuff around like I am, but not. We're really aiming to fight for thoughtful communication when it comes to using words to describe others, as it really does impact the creation of personal identity. And so I feel like that's a very active and ongoing conversation that will never end. And I know it's changed the way that I think about language and the way that our class thinks about language and stereotypes and the way that we apply various aspects of words to various individuals. So, as our society is constantly changing and being reconstituted through new avenues and new people and new ideas, so is activism, so is the status quo. So I just feel like as a person and as a citizen of the world, it should be part of our responsibility to challenge the status quo and just to keep activism going. So, speaking of activism still going, I have to put a little plug in. Next week, in this very room, is going to be our Learning to Buy final volume project, where we will be having roundtable discussions and a short film viewing, and I promise you will leave with a new perspective and maybe a little bit more of an activist mindset in terms of word use. So thank you for your time, and I hope it's generally interesting.
Anyone have questions for Libby at this point?
Regarding your comments about commodity activism, sexualization, and so forth, is it your sense that commodity activism itself relies upon sexualization, individualization, and so forth, and for that reason is fundamentally flawed and needs to be separated from our notions of activism, or that commodity activism in itself can be sort of progressively changed and be a useful venue for the expression of political interests or social change?
As for being tied to sexuality and sexual activism, I don't think it's necessarily inherently tied together. It worked with this project that they did work together to probably not the best end, but you know, can it be tweaked and altered to make some sort of politically charged world? Potentially, and I've thought about this a lot, especially with Tom's shoes, because you actually do buy something. You buy a pair of shoes, but at the same time, a direct pair of shoes goes to someone else. So I've been trying to work that out in my mind as to where the line is drawn. I think it's situational, and also, is there some kind of active call to action or some kind of actual action that you give to be an activist? I don't know if that came out right. I believe that being an activist involves some sort of act, involves some sort of participatory participatory nature. You participate in an activity. So if through buying you end up participating in something, then it could potentially be used, I think, for greater good. But when it's just to buy a t-shirt and say, hey, look what I did for the community, I don't think it really applies. Does that answer your question?
Sure. You know, the GAP campaign and others like it often rely very heavily on sort of an activist aesthetic. I mean, you were talking about sort of